got it running?
What do you want to start with?
It's running.
What do you want to start with? I don't have anything to start out with. I'll call for a picture. Okay, I'll call by number for the show me a picture. But you might want to key up the video for the YouTubers because I want you to show them. Morning, everybody. Morning. Brother Reverend, you, Honorable Reverend, you're a hard act to follow. But I want to tell you something. I'm excited this morning. I'm fired up. I want to tell you why. A lot of us do research. We get on the internet. We go to the library. We look at old letters, manuscripts, minutes of the lodge, grand lodges and lodges, biographies. We sit in a little office somewhere at home or at a library, and we just look and look and look and take notes and come up with something that we're going to present. Well, I did all that, but I also went where history was made. I stood where history was made. I was there. I want to tell you how this all happened. This year, in August, I took a family vacation, which is very important to me because it went back to my roots. When I was a young lad, I went to Nova Scotia every year. My grandfather had a house there. It's a nice big house on an island, 6 acres in the middle of a river. I went there as a young boy from 1950 through 1957. And I made one return trip in 1963. And so this last August, I packed up my sister, my wife, and me, and we drove the 2,400 miles to Nova Scotia, to my grandfather's old house in a little village, less than 500 people. Of course, my grandfather passed, and the house is now going down to my aunt, who was the one that took me up to Nova Scotia every year. And I was there for the whole summer, when school let out until Labor Day, when I had to get back to school. And my second cousin now had the house. And of course, being in Nova Scotia those many years, I had developed some playmates that I saw every summer. So coming back, I looked up to see if there was anybody left that I played with when I was young. There was one person left. His name was Carl Mantle. I couldn't get his phone number, so I had to go up to his door, knock on his door unannounced. And his wife answered the door, and he said, well, Carl was out in the barn. So I went out in the barn, and I heard him rustling around, and I said, Carl, is that you? And he says, yeah, that's me, but who are you? And he came down, and we renewed old times. We hadn't spoken, we hadn't seen each other, heard each other, or had any communication in 51 years. We took off just like it was yesterday. So I made this trip to Nova Scotia, and that has nothing really to do with the subject of this paper. And what I'm speaking to you about today is Reverend Brother John Marrant and Birchtown, Nova Scotia. So I visited many historical sites while I was there, as well as touching base with some old friends. And one of those sites was Shelburne, Nova Scotia. And when I drove down the main street of Shelburne, there were British flags everywhere. And the word loyalist was prominently used on signs, businesses, and all written things. So I was to relearn that a large contingent of white Americans who wanted to remain loyal to the British Crown after the American patriots defeated the British in the Revolutionary War sailed to Nova Scotia in 1783 and settled in what now is the town of Shelburne, Nova Scotia. All this I guess I knew as a child, but it was 51 years since I had last set foot on Nova Scotia soil. The town of Shelburne reports, in the spring of 1783, settlers arrived on the shores of Shelburne Harbor from New York and the middle colonies of America. Assurance of living under the British flag, promises of free land, tools, and provisions lured many to the British colonies at that time. 400 families associated to form a town of Port Roseway, which Governor Parr renamed Shelburne later that year. This group became known as the Port Roseway Associates. In the fall of 1783, a second wave of settlers arrived in Shelburne. By 1784, the population of this new community is estimated to have been at least 10,000, the fourth largest in North America, much larger than either Halifax or Montreal. And when I was in Shelburne, I stopped at the information center, and the information officer there says, okay, says, you know about Birchtown? I said, no. Even as a young child, I said, I don't know anything about Birchtown. What was Birchtown? And he said that, well, that's a small community just 10 miles down the road here from Shelburne, and that was where all the Black Loyalists settled. And he said, there's a museum there, you ought to go see it. So guess where I was the next day? I was at the Black Loyalist Heritage Museum in Birchtown, Nova Scotia. Town was named Birchtown in honor of British Brigadier General Samuel Birch, who signed the majority of the certificates of freedom held by Black Loyalists, most of whom had fought for the British during the Revolutionary War. Can I have picture 1429? This is an actual certificate of freedom. It's on display at the museum. It entitles to the bearer to be a free African American for having fought for the British. Now, how did this all come about? Well, it came about when Lord Dunmore, Royal Governor of Virginia, lost control of that colony to the rebels in the summer of 1775. The economy of Virginia was based on slave labor. Lord Dunmore issued a proclamation that any slave or indentured person would be given their freedom if they took up arms with the British against the rebels. As a result, 2,000 slaves and indentured persons joined his forces. Later, other British supporters in the colonies issued similar proclamations. Then, after that, the British Commander-in-Chief at New York, Sir Henry Clinton, issued the Philipsburg Proclamation when the British realized they were losing the war. It stated that any Negro to desert the rebel cause would receive full protection, freedom, and land. It's estimated that many thousands of people of African descent joined the British and became British supporters. When the endgame came, the top British commanders kept their word to the King's black soldiers. In November 1782, Britain and America signed a provisional treaty granting the former colonies their independence. As the British prepared for their final evacuation, which was from New York City. The Americans demanded the return of American property, including runaway slaves, under the terms of the peace treaty. It was Sir Guy Carleton, the acting commander of British forces, who refused to abandon Black Loyalists to their fate as slaves. With thousands of apprehensive blacks seeking to document their services to the Crown, Brigadier General Samuel Birch, British Commandant of the City of New York, created a list of claimants known as the Book of Negroes. Now, it's very important that you do not confuse the Book of Negroes with a book, a fictional book, which is called the Book of Negroes. There's also a Canadian TV miniseries called the Book of Negroes, and where they've taken fact and blended it with fiction to create a story. Some interesting behind-the-scenes bargaining is very interesting in how this came about and led to this conclusion. In April 1783, the first evacuation fleet left for Nova Scotia. A week later, the British commander, Sir Guy Carleton, sailed up the Hudson Rivers to Orangetown for a conference with George Washington to discuss the evacuation. As the victorious commander, Washington opened the meeting by reiterating the resolution of Congress regarding the delivery of all Negroes and other property. In response, the defeated Carleton indicated that in his desire for a speedy evacuation, he had already sent some 6,000 refugees, including a number of Negroes. He had already sent them off. Observers from both sides noted the general's consternation as he remonstrated with Carleton that the action was against the express stipulation of the treaty. That would be the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war. Calmly, Carleton offered an unapologetic explanation, saying that in his interpretation, the term property meant property owned by Americans at the time the treaty was signed, so did not include those who had responded to British proclamations years before. Never would the British government have agreed to reduce themselves to the necessity of violating their faith to the Negroes, he told Washington. Warming to his subject, he further insisted delivering up Negroes to their former masters would be a dishonorable violation of the public faith. In the unlikely event that the British government put a different construction on the treaty, he promised compensation would be paid to the owners, and to this end he had directed a register be kept of all the Negroes who were sent off. That is the Book of Negroes. Protesting as he was bound to do, Washington understood the depth of feeling behind the words, dishonorable violation of the public faith. By the time the meeting came to its inconclusive end, he had privately conceded defeat. Carleton wrote in icy prose, "The Negroes in question I have already said I found free when I arrived in New York. I had therefore no right, as I thought, to prevent their going to any part of the world they thought proper. Should Washington fail to comprehend his intransigence on this point, he added a thinly veiled warning. I must confess, the mere supposition that the King's minister would deliberately stipulate in a treaty an engagement to be guilty of the notorious breach of public faith towards people of any complexion seems to denote a less friendly disposition than I would wish, and I think less friendly than we might expect." The Book of Negroes was a record of every black that got on a ship bound for Nova Scotia and left New York. What was recorded was the ship, captain, name, where bound, person's name, age, description, and free or non-free claimant. Some 114 ships were gathered for the total evacuation, 15 of which were initially disposed for the evacuation of African Americans.
blacks headed for, over 3,000 blacks headed for various parts of Nova Scotia, with another 2,000 electing to go elsewhere. Other Canadian ports, England, Jamaica, the Bahamas, Germany, Belgium. Here is how, and before I do that, let's take a look at another a picture. 1436, please. This at the museum, they took the Book of Negroes, which is an actual book with names and everything, and they put it on a giant billboard. And there's the names of everybody that came from New York on a ship to Nova Scotia to resettle in freedom. By the way, that kind of research was very helpful to those black families later on in years.